forward to hearing from Wendy Garcia. This program is sponsored by the Office of Campus Life in collaboration with the Office of the Vice President for Student Affairs, the Lehman Lead Club, the MSOL program, and the Center for Human Rights and Peace Studies. I thank my friend, and I see that Dr. Janet DeSimone just jumped on. So I thank my friend and colleague, Dr. Janet DeSimone, for supporting us in all of our programs. She's the faculty advisor for LEAD, and she's actually the one who connected us to Wendy Garcia. I'd also like to acknowledge our very cool and dedicated staff, David Chakape, Nathaniel Gaskew, and Emily Weiland. Emily is actually going to introduce Wendy Garcia.
Hello, everybody. Welcome. As Chief Diversity Officer, Wendy Garcia is responsible for increasing contracting opportunities for women and minority-owned business enterprises, also known as MWBEs, and managing the Comptroller's Office's Internal Supplier Diversity Initiative, as well as other diversity-related projects across all bureaus of the agency. Ms. Garcia also leads the Comptroller's Advisory Council on Economic Growth through Diversity and Inclusion, a group comprised of national, local, corporate, and governmental experts seeking to increase supplier diversity in the public and private sectors. The Comptroller's Office of Diversity Initiatives, led by Ms. Garcia, releases Making the Grade, New York City Agency Report Card on Minority and Women-Owned Business Enterprises, a report that examines how well city agencies meet existing supplier diversity goals while outlining additional measures that could be taken to increase the participation of MWBEs in city contracting. Previously, Ms. Garcia served as the Deputy Chief Diversity Officer at the Office of New York City Comptroller, Director of Community Outreach and Partnerships at the New York City Department of Youth and Community Development, DYCD, Deputy Director of the Manhattan Borough President's Northern Manhattan Office, and Immigrant Research Analyst for the Rockefeller Foundation through Peru College. Ms. Garcia earned a master's degree in urban policy and management from New School University with a concentration in economic development and a Bachelor's of Arts degree at the University of Delaware. And now I'd like to introduce Wendy Garcia.
Hi, thank you so much, Emily. That was a great introduction. Super honored that you introduced me. I'm so excited to be here and really just want to thank all of you watching and taking the time out to Zoom it in with us. As Emily said, I'm Wendy Garcia. I have worked in many offices in government. I have about 14 years in government so far. And I've worked from everything from a borough president's office to now the Comptroller's Office. I did some research analysis, and I was hoping that today I'll talk to you a little bit about the importance of doing equity work in hopes that maybe one of you or all of you, I see we have 33 participants, will become also inspired to go into this industry. Okay, so why don't we jump in? I'll jump right in. Okay, great. So I'm sure a lot of you are wondering, especially after the movement dealing with Black Lives Matter, and you're asking yourself the question, well, I'm a student, I am either an engineer, or maybe you are interested in social services, or maybe you're interested in the sciences, and you're thinking that maybe you want to think about how you can do equity work. A lot of my answer when I hear students say, hey, how do you get into this work? Here's the good news. The good news is that getting into equity work doesn't have one industry. You can do equity in every single industry. You can do equity in government, you can do equity in pharmaceutical, you can do equity in the sciences, you can do equity in law, because the bad news is that systemic racism exists in every industry. And so there's always lots to do. I want to talk to you a little bit about how important it is and what has happened in the city in general when it comes to the work of equity, so you understand the landscape in New York right now. And at around 1989, what happened is that we saw the US Supreme Court really go into what we call the affirmative action plan, right? And that was sort of the beginning and the growing of how do we begin to define equity work across the United States. And I just want to point this out. There's a reason I did this timely so you can understand. 1989 was almost yesterday. Probably most of you could either remember 1989 or know someone who was around in 1989. So we're not talking about an industry that's been around for decades. We're talking about an industry that just now is learning how to walk, is talking and becoming an adult, unlike other industries. By 1992, we saw New York City create the first disparity study, and that was through Mayor Dinkins, and an MWB program was developed. And that was really calling on every single agency across the city to ask one question, which is how much money are you spending with women and minority-owned businesses? By 1994, we saw Giuliani come in, and Giuliani had ended the MWBE program. By 2004 and 2005, we saw it relive again, and then it got reestablished into the $1 Million Program. And I wanted to show you sort of that roller coaster ride, because as you can see, when what goes up always comes back down and then comes back up, but it also means that there was a destabilization of the program at some point, which means it had to restart again somewhere between 2005. And the concept of equity for government really didn't take its full teeth and its claws really until 2018, 2016. And I want to point that out because you're talking about less than 5 years ago, right? So the work of equity not only is it important, but for this generation, for those of you that are sitting in classrooms and learning about and envisioning what your future looks like, you're going to be in the middle of the explosion of the industry, which means for you, you're going to have every opportunity in the world to figure out how you within your particular industry, whether you're an engineer, a scientist, or you want to go into politics and government like me, how you can impact it in your specific industry. So that's sort of the landscape of what's happened in the city of New York. I have some good news. It pays very well. So if you're wondering, but it's also an executive level position. So you can't just graduate and walk into a chief diversity officer role, but you can walk in and speak and begin to do the work. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about what the industry landscape looks like. The hiring of chief diversity officers has tripled since 2019. And you can find that on Diversity Inc. for those of you who are nerds like me and like to research and find out how the industry is doing. Only 12%. But if you look at companies, you'll find that only 12% of the top 50 vendors around the city have chief diversity officers. So while it is growing exponentially, there's still many companies that do not have the role of chief diversity officers at their executive level. This was a big turning point in June 2001 when President Biden signed an executive order actually requiring federal agencies to establish senior level chief diversity officers and equity officers around employment and workforce and really across agencies. Because what does that mean? If you're the US Department of XYZ, you're the Secretary of Commerce, that means that every single time you look at a policy, a new legislation, you implement a program, you now have an equity expert next to you. Saying, hey, how does this impact women and people of color? Hey, how does this impact immigrant communities? How does this impact LGBTQ communities? So you have to, you begin to create equity into the fabric of organizations, which means decisions will now be more inclusive. I'm gonna give you some fun facts, just so that you have a sense. Currently, New York doesn't have a chief diversity officer inside of City Hall, but there is an executive order that exists that says every single city agency must have a chief diversity officer, which is exciting. And I can humbly tell you that I helped create that for New York City. I was responsible for putting that together, and it was not easy. And I can also tell you that it just happened 2 years ago. So the role of Chief Diversity Officer, when I first got in the role, this was 8 years ago, I was the only one, my title was the only role that existed inside of a city agency. It was the first time it had been done for the city of New York and for the controller's office. So it was a historical moment that we were asking questions around how women and people of color were being impacted through the lens of finances. But New York, other places do have chief diversity officers, like Los Angeles has chief diversity officer, Chicago has chief diversity officer. And then you have small towns like, and it's not that Philadelphia is a small town, but you have other smaller cities like Philadelphia, San Antonio, Texas, San Diego, Dallas, Texas. And I want to highlight this for you because if any of you have family or have thought about living in these places, these are areas that you may think are traditionally not as progressive, but they do have progressive policies within their government. And it's important to sort of know because a lot of times we make an assumption about New York City having everything, right? That we are the center, but there's still a lot of progress that we have to make for sure. Here's just a quick fun fact. I call them fun fact, but really it's systemic racism at its best. In New York City right now, last year, not this year anymore, but last year, 84% of women and people of color who did business with the city didn't get any dollars from the city of New York. And I just want to highlight that. And the reason why that's important is because when we think about how we build wealth, when you go outside and you go to your local bodega and you're trying to buy anything, every single time you take $1 out of your wallet and you spend it at a local store, in an area where there are women and people of color that own that space, it is likely that you are also building wealth for that family and for the families impacted and employed by that company. Why is that important? Because most companies who are owned by women and people of color are 5 times as likely to hire other women and people of color and folks from the LGBT community. And we will create a ripple effect when we do this kind of work. And so actually I'm gonna, because we talked a little bit about this, correct? I'm gonna phase out of here so it won't be too, I want to give people some time. I wanted to show those watching these facts so you have a sense that systemic racism comes in form. It doesn't come in the form that it used to come in. So you're not going to hear someone say, don't drink at that water fountain. You may, but that's not how it shows up anymore. You're not going to hear someone say, you're going to come in and they're going to say, no Hispanic, no Black allowed at the bathroom. It's not going to come up. The way it comes up is by exclusion, by lack of opportunity. And so now we have to, when we're looking for systemic issues, when we're looking on how systemic racism has an impact, we now have to look at where the money goes, how it's being utilized, who's benefiting, and begin to ask those questions. And just for me, this work around diversity and inclusion has been both exciting and exhausting, the 2 E's, because it constantly puts me in a place where I have to be very uncomfortable, and I have to be comfortable being uncomfortable. And I have to do that to other people as well, because it means that I have to hold others accountable when they have blind spots. And it happens to all of us. It happens to people of color. It happens to white males. It happens to white females. And those are things that put you in a constant place of evolution. What I can tell you, and I'll make a quick stop here in case someone wants to interject with a question and we can be a little bit more interactive. because I know I've been going on for 20 minutes now. I'm looking at the clock. But what I can tell you is, just so you know a little bit about me, I grew up in Washington Heights. So I'm a born and bred New Yorker. My family is from the Dominican Republic. When I went to University of Delaware, and I also went to the New School. And never did I think at that point that I was going to be a chief diversity officer or the head of equity and inclusion for a company. But what I did do my whole life is the work of equity and inclusion. There just had not been a major, the way you can become a doctor, the way you can become a lawyer. So I'm actually so excited for a lot of you that can choose to do this work, who can take curriculum, who can hear someone who has expertise in multiple areas, sort of give you this sense of like, what do you do in this industry? How do you do this work? Because a lot of this work around equity and inclusion has been happening for a long time. We just had never streamlined it as an educational space in schools. So I am really proud that Lehman is doing this kind of work and putting this together. Shout out to all of you, because I know this is not easy to really put together curriculum for young people, put together curriculum for students who are interested in creating a new evolution of the way we think, and really changing the fabric of organizations. Because the reality is that any organization you touch moving forward, literally any organization that you touch moving forward, with this knowledge, you will begin to create an equilibrium and efficiency by doing the work of equity, that it will no longer function the same in a good way. You don't want it to function the same. That's actually the goal. But change can be a little scary. So there's some tools that you have to learn along the way to do this work. I'll talk a little bit about the tools next, but I'll take some questions. If you have questions about, we'll do a few questions. If you have questions about me or the role, I'll talk a little bit about that. And then I'll move into the second part, which is, how do you do this job?
We do have a question in the chat. How do educators who work at schools who receive less funding challenge how the money is dispersed, keeping equity and inclusion in mind?
Oh, that's a good one. That's a great one. If you're an educator and could they specify if they're a teacher in the role of teacher or principal? Did they specify at all?
Somebody was nodding in their head in the chat. Yes.
Teachers. Okay. Because every dynamic has a different question that they can ask. If you're a teacher, and most of the time, if you're a teacher and you're either in a union, or the union is going to kill me for saying this, or you're in some part of a group, a larger group that allows you to advocate on behalf of your specific title, the best way to do it is, number one, you call a meeting where you ask for transparency and accountability. Transparency, number one, because you can't accuse a school. I mean, there are things we just know, right? We always know that we're always lagging because we can see it with our eyes. We're not blind. But it is important that when you do the work of equity and you're advocating on equity, that you match it up with numbers. So what you want to do is you want to ask the first question, which is, can we talk about how many women and teachers of color and LGBT community do we have in the school? One, that's an easy question. That's extracted right out of data. That's a transparent data request. The second layer question you want to ask, and of those teachers, what percentage let's break down the percentage by ethnicity, by background, by disadvantaged community, however you'd like to break it up. And the third question, which is the most important question, is ask for their ranking and pay. Because what you want to see is, within your industry, are women getting paid less than men? The answer is most of the time yes, but you want the numbers. It's the second question. Who has 2 years, because now you're going to look at inequity in experience and pay. And so these are some questions that become that only become uncomfortable when you don't have the data. If you have the data and someone can break that down for you, then these are solutions that you can come up with together. Well, how do we equalize pay? We can talk a little bit about that after I take more questions. How do we equalize, how do we do racial equity work around that? How we talk about retention and hiring. But those are, I hope I answered your question, but those are an easy 2 to 3 questions that should be able to begin to move the ball forward. And then I also recommend that you begin, doesn't matter what school or where you are, a diversity and inclusion committee that begins to ask these questions.
I don't see any more questions in the chat at the moment.
Okay, if you have a question about how do you step into a role like this, I'm happy to answer that as well. I just want to make sure before I move into the second part, and we'll give folks a little time.
Actually, I might have a question of, would this also,
Emily, go right ahead.
thank you. Would this also benefit, or do you look at numbers on people with disabilities?
Of course. So the world of equity and inclusion is a wide range. You know, my rule of thumb is always doing this work. Like, is this a community that has been disadvantaged? And really the answer is, if you're not a white male, answer is yes. It is a community. Now there are levels, you know, to how everything is hammered out, but it's important that you think, like, for example, if we lived in California in middle America, we'll be talking a lot more about the indigenous community. If we lived in upstate New York, if we were, depending on what part of if we lived in London, you know, we would have a different discussion around equity and inclusion. But in essence, it comes down to one thing: non-white males. That really is sort of the essence of the work, which is pretty much everybody. You know, the reason this is a problem is because we're talking about the removal of the majority of the voices.
Awesome. Thank you so much. We do have more questions in the chat now too. If an organization is not focusing on diversity and inclusion, how can you be that force?
Can you repeat the question? An organization, I just didn't.
Yeah, if an organization is not focusing on diversity and inclusion, how can you be that force?
It all depends on where you sit in that organization. I'm going to give you 3 levels. If you sit on the front lines, where maybe you're not in the policy making table, but you do, you know the work, you know the organization, you know the company, which happens a lot, then I would request, I would first create a team of people that feel similar to you. And then the first move I would do is then go to the head or supervisor you're with and say, hey, there's a few of us, 6 or 7, 2, 3. I love the number 4, but 3 is fine, who feel the same. And we would like to create a group, an equity group, to begin to ask the questions. For me, what I found professionally in the last 10 years is that asking the question is the most important part of this work. You ask the right question, you'll begin to get answers. A lot of times people want to say, your organization doesn't have enough Latina, your organization doesn't have enough African Americans, which is likely to be true. However, when you don't have the numbers and the data behind it, it allows for the work to be dismissed. And so you really don't want that. You want to always couple it with numbers. If you are in middle management and you're, let's say, a director, but you're not at the policy level, that's a great place, because most of the time you have professional groups. And let's say you don't like anybody at your job and you're just like, oh, I just want to ask the question myself. And you don't even want to do anything with the company. I'm just, because I've seen this too. There's a few things you can do as a supervisor yourself, where you can carry out the work on your own team. So you can do things like, when you hire, you make sure that every single time you bring a person on, you follow this concept that's similar to the Rooney Rule. And it basically says you don't hire a finalist until you make sure that your pile of candidates has women, people of color, LGBT. You don't move forward with the process, that's all. So you make sure that when you're making a decision, you're making a decision that's inclusive. Those are little small things you can do just as a director, a supervisor, a manager. And if you're at the head, then you have a major responsibility, right? That's sort of where this work is, which is you should be creating a chief diversity officer role. You should be looking at the policies, and that's what I'll talk about across the board in every single department. That's a different kind of responsibility.
That makes a lot of sense. Our next question is, what is a good way to step in this role if you have an HR background?
Yeah, HR, did they say HR background?
HR.
HR, oh, actually, funny, I will tell you, I don't have an HR background, but the role actually prefers HR background, but you don't have to have an HR background. So I'm gonna give you some boring stats. In the United States, the majority of the role is based out of HR and or academia. Those are the two. This role, the one I'm carrying now that's in government, it's like it's sort of like the new monster of DEI. It's like, whoa, what are you doing? Why? Mine is more across the board. So I function more at sort of like what they would call CEO level, because I'm over the whole company or the whole institution, which is a new dynamic of more of accountability. If you are in HR, and let's say you don't want that, let's say you just like, thanks a lot, Wendy, but no thanks. I was trying to do every single department. I love equity, but I just want to do it in HR because that's what I love to do. That's great and fine. Most HR, you're seeing a trend now where most companies across the United States are hiring equity experts within HR. So you can ask the questions around retention, hiring, salary. You want to make sure that the work environment is appropriate to receive women and people of color, that microaggressions are not happening, that trainings are taking place, that white privilege is being discussed and talked about. So there's lots of fine and beautiful work being done in the HR field. Like I said earlier, there's not one industry, whether you're a scientist or the head of HR, that does not have an equity fabric to it, because everything is systemically racist. And so that means there's a lot of work to do.
Yes, and our last question at the moment in the chat is, what are some examples of projects you led that you are most proud of?
Yeah, okay, I would say my favorite project is that I created chief diversity officers in the city of New York for the whole city. So the idea of having a chief diversity officer was not something that, I got official, like at first people were like, yes, that is a wonderful idea. Actually, it took me 6 years until the executive order came in, and I was focused and really relentless about it, and even tempered, of course, and I had all my data all the time. And then finally that voice was heard. I did it with a group of many stakeholders who played a role way before I came into this. Like, they were already advocating for this, and I had just kind of taken it into the next level. And so because of that, now there's a mandate that every single city agency in New York, and there's 141 agencies, has to have a chief diversity officer at the executive level. And that for me was a big deal, to be able to be part of that legislation. I remember I went to vote that day, and I also was part of the making sure that the program for women and people of color was codified for the first time. What does that mean? In government talk, it means that before that program was codified, if any mayor came in or anybody felt like coming in and taking it away, they could, because it wasn't part of the budget. Now, if someone comes in and they say, hey, let's take this program out of the budget, which wouldn't be smart, but let's say it happened and we had someone like the former president and they wanted to obsolete that, they could. But now it's in the Constitution. So I was able to be part of constitutionalizing the program that that was building wealth for women and people of color. So that for me was a tearjerker for sure. Like the New Yorkers had to vote on it. And so I took my kids that day. I have an 11-year-old and a 13-year-old. And, you know, they filled in the bubble saying, yes, we want this program. And of course, like, it, you know, these are not things that make the news. They're not like cool things that happen, but, you know, I knew, and my colleagues knew, we gave each other high five. That was probably the most so far what I've been proud of.
Oh, we do have another question, and that's awesome, by the way. What programs are available that promote MWOB in New York City?
Yeah, so if you're a business owner and you want to learn more about how to be part of the New York City business program, the Department of Small Business actually has what they call a certification, that where you send your application in, you can go to SBS, nyc.sps, and you put in MWBE certification, you put in your information, and they usually have a turnaround time of about 3 weeks to certify you as a woman or minority-owned business. All it means is that when there's a contract that comes out and they assign a percentage to that contract, it means that you will be considered highly and more likely to compete for that contract. So imagine if it's a $2 billion contract, what that means for you. It means you're more likely to be more competitive than other members. But there are lots of benefits to be part of it. I highly encourage it. You know, people have questions after, I'm happy to send links for that.
I think that's it. Oh, there is. Is there a particular model that you use to measure?
I do. I have a model. Half of it, I would say 60% of the model is things that I've read, best practice, like literature that I've read on diversity and inclusion. And the other 40% is like my own sauce. It's kind of like, you know, when someone says, I don't know how many people have like rice and beans and chicken. I make rice and beans and chicken in my house. And it's like, there's a way to make rice, but everyone makes rice differently. So that's kind of like, that's how I approach this work. There's some basic 5 steps that you can find everywhere that people say. First step is you want to make sure you have the data in front of you. So making sure that you understand workplace data, asking the questions around how many, which people, under what level, because that's racism exists in hierarchy and in parallel hiring. It's this way and that way, if that makes any sense right now. And so you want to make sure that you do engagement, because it doesn't matter if I'm moving numbers, if nobody knows. It's like if a tree falls, no one's around here, did it fall? It fell, but no one knows. So how do I know not to trip when I walk down that forest lane? And so engagement is really important. You want to make sure that you talk to people about the work you're doing. And it's important because you don't have all the answers. So you may be at an institution where you're working on, you may be an engineer that's working on engineering things, but you don't know what the architect is doing. And you may have to work with the architect, and also accept that the work of equity is one line, and then there's industries that have other opinions. And so I always recommend that people put together an advisory board, an internal advisory board of experts. You as the head of equity should not at all ever take on the everything goes through me and must be done in this way, because the reality is you're gonna get a lot more ideas from your colleagues, and you get more ideas from people who are on the front lines. That's the reality. So I built out a task force. I think Emily talked about that earlier, of about 20 national stakeholders. And I don't think I could have done that work without them. Like there would be no way. Even the legislation that I was so proud of, that came from one of the advisory board members. They were like, the biggest problem is X, Y, and Z. And so we took it on. And those are, I would say, the third, there are many. So I'll keep it at the third one, because I'm also looking at time. The third one is you want to make sure that you do accountability. It's really nice to say you're doing diversity and equity until you have to tell your colleague they're practicing systemic racism inside of an office. because it can get really uncomfortable. And so I like to talk a lot about, you know, the exhaustive side of this job, which can feel maybe to some folks uncomfortable. Some people will say it's confrontational. Some people will say that it's like it's too much. Nobody wants to do anything. So everyone says the same. And it's not that. Change is hard for everybody. Change is hard for the person implementing the change. Change is hard for the person that has to do their job differently. So it really has to be a collaborative effort. It just has to be a mutual respect there. And that's not something you build overnight. So just to give you an example, let's say I work with Suzette. And Suzette wanted to, and Suzette every day does her workshops. And then I find out, I said, hey, Suzette, I know you always do your workshops. They're so great. How many kids of color go to the event? Suzette's going to say to me, she has so many kids of color all the time. And then I'm going to say, oh, yeah. Suzette, do you have the numbers for that? And Suzette's going to be like, well, we don't really have the numbers because X, Y, and Z, you know? And so those are the kind of things that it feels like someone's questioning you, and the person asking the question could be in an uncomfortable place constantly with their colleagues. So it has to be done with lots of grace, compassion, and understanding that everybody wants to do their best, but at the same time, there is accountability that has to take place. And that's why the data is so important in how this gets moved along. Let's say, let me give you the same scenario in a different way once everything's established. Hey, Suzette, how many kids of color come to the event? 30, I don't know, I'm just making this up. 10, great. What's the total? 20, okay, so 50%. And what's the breakdown? And she says, 5 are Hispanic, 5 are Black, 10 are whatever she can do, 3 are Asian. Great, so now what is that telling us? Oh, we have to do more work on this particular side. We need to do more outreach there. And so the numbers really allow for the two experts who are making decisions around how equity is going to be part of the fabric of the organization to come up with recommendations that both change both their jobs, meaning how we implement things moving forward, but also what organizational support that person needs to move it forward. Here's the other thing that happens. Hey, Suzette, do you have the time to put together 10 more events that would address X, Y, and Z? Then Suzette's gonna say, actually, I don't, because I have these 10 other things. Great, it looks like you need support, Suzette. So because I'm the executive level chief diversity officer, let me go over to my HR friends who I work with and say, hey, Suzette needs help. She needs X, Y, and Z, and this is part of the equity work. And so when equity is prioritized in that way, when you have a senior level person, that's what it does. It eases the efficiency of the organization so that everyone can do their job better.
That's really cool. We do have more questions in the chat. What books do you recommend to learn more about the work?
Yeah, so one of my favorite books, it's gonna sound weird. One of my favorite books is The Color of Money. And I have it in my Audible, but it's The Color of Money. It actually talks a lot about how money was divided during redlining. And particularly it talks about the African-American community being excluded out of direct loans and neighborhoods, and how actually banks were built on this concept. That's how communities of color actually ended up having less resources, because there were federal laws created around banking that encourage redlining and being exclusive. And to me, it's just such a well done book, because what it shows you is that it's the systemic racism no longer was sitting on a sign saying don't drink at this water fountain. It was living inside of loans and contracts, and it was living inside of who can live somewhere and who can't live somewhere, but not directly, just by the way money flowed. And so, systemic racism, it was a person, it got more creative with time because it needed to survive. As new laws came in, it had to kind of metamorph into kind of like Omicron, like COVID. We had the first strand and there was another strand, and now I think there's this third strand. But and so you have to be, when you do this work, you have to be very creative, because it does move quickly enough to kind of you can't work on like old systems. You have to be proactive about where it could go. So, you know, you end up being like the CDC, coming up with new policy for the office every 3 months or so.
I'm definitely going to be getting that book because we were just talking about that again with my leadership group. What is the most difficult part of your career and how did you get through it?
Yeah, I would say, I don't know if there's a difficult part, but I think, you know, as you can see, I am a Latina woman. I said I was Dominican earlier, and it is emotionally, I'm a human being, so it's emotionally exhausting. To even just to look at numbers and because yeah, as you get the spidey sense on this work, you can pick it out. You know, you can pick out much easier when there's systemic racism in a structure. And so, how can I describe it? It's like being a chef who eats at a bad restaurant, but everyone else thinks it's a good restaurant. Have you ever gone out with a chef and they're like, it's low on salt, and you're like, it's fine, just eat the burger, and they just can't let it pass. That's the hardest part about my job, that the longer I do it, I think I'm just sharpening my skill set. So because I can pick it out faster, you know, I have sad moments because I can see it a lot quicker than probably most people are trained eye. And so that can be sad for me as a human. Like, I have sad Dominican girl moments, like, oh, okay, let's go after this now.
That's really, I can't imagine how emotional that would be, a constant, like,
it can be,
yeah.
It is an absolute emotional part. If you are a person who comes from a disadvantaged community, it's hard to look at this and not become emotional about it. I mean, it's just part of being human. So you just have to train yourself to kind of like have a system in place to create solutions for it.
Yeah, definitely. Our next question is, how did you get veteran staff to buy into your methods and the strategies you share?
Yeah. I think number one, you have to respect that the expert is your colleague, not you. You're the expert in equity and inclusion. Your colleague is the expert in what they do. When you have that mindset, you begin with that mindset, and you begin with the mindset of understanding that everyone plays a role in this. Then you go from colleague to colleague in creating a plan collaboratively that's beneficial for the organization. My first 3 months when I was in the controller's office, that's what I did. I literally interviewed every decision maker in my office. And I asked them, what are the top 5 decisions you make? And I wanted to know, what do you sign off on? Do you sign off on budget? Do you sign off on, because I knew that whatever they signed off on means that they had the final decision. And if that final decision was in their accountability, and it was a decision that maybe they weren't aware of, wasn't inclusive, then who I could go to would be that person. But understanding how they made the decision was the most important part for me, because at some point between the recommendation of the solution and the final decision, that's where systemic racism usually lives. It doesn't live in the end or in the beginning. It's right there, right in the core middle. And so understanding how things moved up the ladder was very important for me, because what I did was create systems before they reached final decision that didn't allow for that decision to be an inequitable decision. And those are things we had to learn together. Sometimes I didn't have all the answers because I didn't know how everyone did their job. And they came up with their own strategies, like, oh, you know what, I realized that when I do this. So starting those conversations, getting buy-in is really more, it's not about getting buy-in on my ideas, it's making sure that whatever ideas we're coming up with, we're all buying in, that we're going to commit to this together. And that my role is really accountability on what we've already decided to do.
Yeah. Our next question is, we have lots of leadership students here. So what advice would you give them in general about being a leader for equity, diversity, and inclusion in whatever field they work? And what are the top values that are important?
Yeah, this is gonna sound a little off topic, but being a leader really comes from a place of being comfortable in your own skin. And because this work can be uncomfortable, it's really important that you do a lot of self-development, because you have to learn to listen with a mature ear, but look with a youthful eye. And this is the best way I can describe it. You're gonna see the same things happen over and over again. The same type of racism happen, the same type of inequity happen in different departments when you do this work all the time. And you'll say, oh, but when you look at it like, you see how young, like when people are young, they're still like, we can still figure this out. Mature ears and youthful eyes will allow you to come up with recommendations, but notice when something is not okay, and still have the passion to inspire you to see the same thing over and still come up with new solutions for it. I think I said this earlier, you know, the concept of having a chief diversity officer in every single city agency, I must have wrote about that my second year into the work. And I didn't see the fruits of that till 6 years later. And every year I said the same thing. I wrote the same article. I gave the controller the same talking points. Then I did another seasoning. I was like, what if we say it like this? And like the last year, after, like right after Black Lives Matter, I remember I was sitting in my living room and I was like, okay, let me see if we introduce the same article again, but now there's momentum. And then the minute we wrote the article in the paper, boom, the executive order, everyone agreed that there needed to be a new executive order. So sometimes sometimes it's timing, it's capitalizing on like momentum, the work of equity, if it wasn't for Black Lives Matter, you wouldn't see all these institutions placing this kind of priority on it. And so for those of us that have been doing the work before the movement, we can feel the difference. So that's why I'm saying you can't do this by yourself. Like if you have a group, form a group if you need to. And if not, then if you're not a group person, then definitely you can do the work individually. But yeah, there's a lot that.
I personally love that. Absolutely love that. We do not have any other questions at the moment in the chat. So.
Okay. Here's what I can say just to kind of close off, because I see it's about 6:50. I don't know if my watch is correct. But for those of you that are highly interested in doing this kind of work, here's some recommendations. See if you can if you're at the school currently, see if you can do some work either in research around diversity and equity. So for example, if you're currently taking a class and the teacher's assigning you 4 papers and none of them are on topics you like, go to the professor and say, can I write this, but on the impact of women and people of color? So use the topic and then just focus on that. I did a lot of that, and I actually worked to my benefit, I think. I always made every topic go back. I did that when I was in college. And I see the difference in sort of my base of knowledge now. And I didn't even know, I just did it because I guess this is my calling. And so I just innately knew that's what I wanted to do. I would also recommend that if you want to learn leadership skills and learn advocacy, which is an important part of this role too, you should be part of whatever group advocates for disadvantaged community. Even if it's like lacrosse team, Latina lacrosse team. I don't care if it's a sports team. I don't care if it's a professional debate team. It doesn't matter. As long as you're part of a group that puts you in a position where you have to advocate for a particular group, because those skill sets are going to come in handy later on. If you are a student that is working and you're also in school, and maybe you're like, I'm here at the school because I kind of want to change professions, then I would look closely into EEO positions, which is normally in HR if you're in the HR department, because you'll learn workplace environment, those kind of key skill sets that'll lead to chief diversity officer level. But let's say you don't want to do HR and you're kind of like, no, Wendy, no thanks. Leave that to the last questionnaire. That's not really my thing. And you are, I'm just giving different scenarios. And let's say you are in the arts and science. You're getting just an arts and science. You're in the arts and science sector. Then I would place myself in an internship with someone doing diversity and inclusion work. Whether that's in the mayor's office has a lot of, that's in the controller's office, there's internships there. Because what you wanna do is gain the skill sets to look at data. I know not everybody loves statistics, but you wouldn't believe how important it is to learn the skill set of looking at patterns and developing formulas. I never thought in my life that my statistics was going to be used so highly. And 8 years ago, when I developed the formula for the formula that will dictate if agencies around the city were going to get an A or a B with women and people of color. I had to look at a math formula. I didn't develop it. There was a math team that did it, but I had to be able to look at it and see if those numbers made sense. And so those are, I would say, some core skill sets that you should be ready to have.
Beautiful. Yeah, and we do have more questions. Who were your mentors and what are some of the suggestions they gave you?
Yeah, I had a lot of mentors. You know, I don't think, and I think this holds true. I would say this holds true for lots of women and people of color, particularly Latina women. It's not like there was another person who was a chief diversity officer and I was like, excuse me, ma'am, could you talk to me a little bit? It didn't exist. And so I was lucky that I met people along the way that would open a door, then I went through it, and then there was another person, and then they opened that door, and they were like, good luck, I don't know anything about that door, but I'll try to open it for you, kind of thing. So I had many people help me along the way. There were people that helped me that I didn't even know helped me, right? And so what I would recommend, relationships are really important. And not in a way, try not to make it like, would you be my mentor? It's not that. It's almost like the old saying of Uncle Sam, ask what you can do for your country, not what Uncle Sam can do for you. Ask what you can do for others. Like people appreciate hard work ethic. Work ethic is really important. I would say that I always try to make sure that anybody I worked with, that I gave them the best of me in terms of quality, and that when I messed up and I didn't do it well, that I owned up to it. So there was a character that I tried to build and establish myself along the way that I think allowed people that even if they didn't want to help me, that's okay too, or didn't have time because life is like that, that at the very least, if I called them and say, hey, can you just say a couple things about me, that when they spoke, they could speak honestly about the fact that I was a hard worker, that I gave it my all, and that the times that I messed up, I owned up to it. So I think my advice would be, don't get so caught up on having a mentor and be more of, always be a student. Be willing to learn from people, and you'll find that you'll not just get one mentor, you'll get 15 mentors.
I love that. Our next question is, what advice will you give school counselors on the call?
School counselors, depends. Ask the person to elaborate. About what? Like, what are they? Like school counselors who want to do equity work?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
So we have students, Wendy, from our multicultural counseling class on here. Mm-hmm. So we've been talking a lot about this all semester. So I'm just, were there school counselors that influenced you? How can they really integrate this? Just your perspective.
Yeah, I think, well, two things. I'm going to be honest, I can't think of like a school counselor that was like fabulous. Maybe there was one she was in school counselor. There was a teacher that was really great that I had in high school. Her name was Miss Edwards. And they weren't giving any of the kids of color an opportunity to apply for four-year schools. They kept giving us like the community colleges at the high school that I went to. And so I think, and I didn't know any better, and neither did my mom, because she hadn't gone to college. So I didn't really have somebody that I can,
So I think she's frozen. Actually. Maybe it's the connection.
and come to my office 5 o'clock and I want your mom there. It's like, Mom, you gotta go to school. Miss Edwards is not playing. And so we went, and my mom just sat there as I filled out the application. And I didn't even realize that I was applying to the University of Delaware at the time, but I sure was. And I applied to Penn State, the community college. So I went first to the community college, I went to Penn State, and then I went to the University of Delaware. But you know, I don't think I would have gone to university. I had not even been a thought. I didn't understand that it was different. And those are things that, unless you have a sister, a cousin, if you're first generation college student, it's hard to look for someone who can ask those questions. And so this is a two-part question. So if you're a counselor, just make sure you, and I'm sure a lot of you know this already, but we're having a little, just make sure there are small things that are very big that particularly happen in communities of color that are, and so understanding the things that disproportionately happen to students of color, and is going to be important to doing your job, because when you send out those college applications and say, hey, Wendy, how come you didn't fill out 1 through 10? 1, I didn't have the money. 2, what is FAFSA? I don't even know what that is. Hey, I know you have 30 kids that you have to look at, but you may want to do a night just for kids of color, because their parents are probably really, really busy working multiple jobs. If you have a lower income population, or even if you have a higher income population, they may not have the same knowledge and networks. So that reference letter, who has a reference? I don't know. I can tell you, my mom was cleaning and she was a cashier. Who was gonna be my reference? I don't know. You know, I had a reference because one of my teachers did. One of my teachers had done that. And so there's some nuances that disproportionately happen to people of color that I think are important to know as a counselor. And so if you're taking a class now, and that's what you want to do, I would say you write your first paper on what are the top 20 challenges that don't happen in white communities, that particularly happen with kids of color in the process from ninth grade to first year students, so that you can begin to come up with your own data and survey. And there's not going to be a class on this. No one's going to teach you. Teach yourself what that is through your own research. So you learn how to be a researcher and look at it from an academic point of view. And then you practice it every day when people come into your office. And those two things are equally as important.
We're about a minute away from the end. Are there any final words of wisdom, tips, anything that resonates with you?
Doing equity work is the most rewarding job I have been very lucky and honored to do. It is the most exhausting job, but I would say that everything that's worth loving is worth fighting for, and also it's worth making the effort. There are going to be times where there is no solution. There will be times where you do this work and you may not have a win. And so my advice is that if you decide to come into this, understand that you're eating the elephant one bite at a time, but that it'll be worth it at the end. You will see beautiful results if you stick with it.
I'd like to thank you. Oh, sorry, Suzette. I'd like to thank you, not just for your words of wisdom and your time with us today, but just in general, what you do. You're so inspirational. So I thank you so much for spending time with us and again, what you do.
No, thank you. And I'm excited. You know, if we ever go in person, you can feel free to, we'll do that in person. I would love to see the students behind the meeting.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Wendy. This was really awesome. Hope you have a good night. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much. And like Suzette, I will call you later. I'll call you tomorrow, okay? Thank you, Emily. Thank you, Suzette. Thank you,